Pull that up real quick. All right. Okay, so here's our continuation of chapter 14. As you remember, in the first 25 verses that we talked about a few weeks back, um, we talked about St. Paul's explanation on how to properly understand the use of the spiritual gifts, specifically speaking in tongues, and that the speaking tongues should be used on a specific basis with interpretation when used publicly, and prophecy was the authoritative message from God that is confirmed and is more profitable because it builds up more of the community directly. And so that was kind of, we had a big discussion of the different parts of like the use of speaking in tongues and how even it's spiritually beneficial in certain ways, but at the same time it's very limited. And even St. Paul spoke on the last time that it's sometimes this is language that only he understands or even not understanding, but uses in worshiping God. But at the same time, he prays that all of us will have the ability of prophecy, which he'll explain further on in this last section of chapter 14. So if I can have somebody just read these 6 verses for me, and then we'll go with the explanation.
How is it then, brethren, whenever you come together, each of you has a psalm, has a teaching, has a tongue, has a revelation, has an interpretation? Let all things be done for edification. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be 2 or at the most 3, each in turn, and let one interpret. But if there is no interpreter, let him keep silent in church, and let him speak to himself and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge. But if anything is revealed to another who sits by, let the first keep silent. For you can all prophesy one by one, that all may learn and all may be encouraged. And the spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace, as in all the churches of the saints.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Susan. So when you look at this passage, verses 26 through 33 provides the conclusion on the subject about how we should be properly using these gifts. Like as I mentioned earlier, St. Paul is writing this letter specifically and directing the church in Corinth and how to properly worship, how to make sure that they're not causing division based off different practices or people's feelings of what they believe is properly to be done, or the cliques that have been going on. And so this, particularly on this section that we've been studying, the speaking in tongues has been one of the points of contention amongst the community, or at least specifically, what is the better of the gifts, right? And so now he's talking about, now when we get this last section, this is all in the context, like as we talked about previously, in the context of the worshiping community, right? This is when they're coming together to worship as a church. And this is where it's more specific, where St. Paul is talking about there needs to be a proper order of how the worship should be done when they're coming to and common to worship as a Christian, as the body of Christ, as the church. And so he's now giving that format. One offers a psalm, some does a teaching and revelation, and then also speaking in tongues. When it's offering a psalm, it's a song taken from one of the psalms, or someone is a reading from the psalm. If you kind of look at how St. Paul has, broken down the worship in this section, we see even our church's format of our worship into a certain level is following a similar format, right? With psalms and teachings and the preaching of the word. So but not as specific. But as if you look at other denominations and other churches and how they form out their worship services, there's many of the evangelical churches who use this specific format of allowing someone to speak or sing a song, and then there's someone who's to teach the faith, and then there's if there's some revelation and revealing an insight of the faith of the Christian church or of Christ, and then speaking tongues, which should be followed by an interpretation, which means that there should be a message of uplifting. So if there's a speaking of tongues, it should be something that provides an upliftment for the people, right? So that's what the format he gives. And so the protocol or the order of the worship that he gives is that he's saying to make it orderly and to be able to follow the same format each time they come together, so that everyone knows what to expect. There's a format, and there's the main, more than anything else, an orderliness in the regular worshiping of the community. Maximum 3 people can speak in tongue with interpretation. If no interpreter, then the one having gift of tongue should remain silent for public worship. He's very specific about that. And then he says that 2 or 3 prophets should speak and others discern. So it's very interesting. He says 2 or 3 prophets can speak. Similar to the speaking tongues, there's people who speak a prophecy, as we talked, and I mentioned earlier, that's the prophets, the ones are giving an authoritative message from God, and that has been confirmed as more, that is confirmed by the community. So when he talks about others, when he's talking about others to discern, these others are most likely not other prophets, but the leaders of the assembly, the presbyters or the priest, the president, depending on the translation you have, those who are leading the worship. There's always one leader or 1 or 2 who is leading the worship community, right? And so they are there to discern what they're speaking, if it's true or not. So the revelation that is provided by the leaders who can confirm that the prophecy is trustworthy and for the common good. That's when we look at church tradition and look at more deeply into the commentaries of the St. Paul's epistle. This is what we put together, all that he's written and how the church understood it. It's always for the common good. And if this prophecy is spurious or something it doesn't go in line with the faith and tradition of the church, or it's not applicable to them, then the prophet is to accept that they to be silent. Like the leaders or the presbyters of the assembly will tell them that that's not a word that's good for the common good, and they should remain silent. Similar to how speaking tongues, if there's no interpreter, they have to remain silent. Even these prophets, if it's discerned by the leadership that what they are teaching or revealing is not in line with the faith and tradition that's been handed down faithfully by the apostles into their disciples, into the church to that point, and to this day, then it is asked to be silent. And so even in verse 31, it says, all can provide prophecy one by one for the teaching of building up of the community with proper discernment by the assembly. That's the key thing. So similar to speaking tongues, those who have the gift of prophecy have to be mindful that it is also to the discernment of the leadership and accepted by the community as a whole. If it's not, then they have to remain silent. That's the way, the protocol, to make sure that everything that is being said is seen as true. No one is like, either by, for whatever reason is making up things, or it's a spirit that's leading to God, whatever it might be. There's a counsel, or there's a need for making sure that what is being preached is something that is in line with the Christian faith, with what Christ had handed down to the apostles. Because there's a lot of chance of someone to take advantage of this community and just say things that might sound right at a surface level, but is not in line with the faith and teaching of the church, right? And even as we study church tradition, history, there's many heresies that the church over the centuries, even from the very beginning, had to be very mindful to call out and to separate from it. So even in St. Paul, he's making sure that there is a proper format so people know what is true and what it's not, right? And so we see this already in his epistle to the Corinthians. So that means that prophets do not have an unchallenged authority over the assembly of the church. If the church finds his teaching spurious, he must remain silent, like I said. And a true prophet, if he's a true prophet and it's sincere, he'll know that should be able to remain, he or she should remain silent. All this being said, it reminds us that, in the previous section, the time in earlier in chapter 14, and even a little bit the previous chapter, and actually in 12, and so he wished all could speak, be as prophets or as teachers, right? And it seems like he's trying to exalt that over those who speak in tongues, and it's like so much better than there's no kind of restrictions compared to those with the gift of speaking tongues. But as he's now highlighting this second half of chapter 14, even these prophets there's a checks to what they are saying, right? There's a balance. So it's not just about speaking tongues. All the different gifts, there is a balance, and there's a checks to make sure what is being taught, what is being spoken amongst the community as a whole is always being checked and made sure that what is being said is true. Because if it's not, it can lead people astray very quickly, right? It can lead to a lot of division, which is happening now. That's why St. Paul is having to write this epistle to them, right? So the main teaching that he's trying to highlight is the liturgical worship for the community should be done with order, so that there is peace. I put it and harmony in the worship, not in harmony. Peace and harmony in the worship, right? So that's the key thing. So that if people are speaking something that's against the teachings, that'll cause a division. Or someone is speaking where no one can understand, that can cause a struggle for the community. So St. Paul is making sure and highlighting that when they are coming together as a community of the faithful, it should all be leading and directing everyone to a true, the worship of the one true God, and everyone is able to participate and to understand and to be able to and to be uplifted by that worship service. Okay, then we get to the last few verses of the chapter. If somebody can read these last few verses, and then we'll go through the explanation of this part and the discussion. Anyone, please.
Let your women keep silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but they are to be submissive, as the law also says. And if they want to learn something, let them ask their own husbands at home, for it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Or did the word of God come originally from you? Or was it you only that it reached? If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. But if anyone is ignorant, let him be ignorant. Therefore, brethren, desire earnestly to prophesy, and do not forbid to speak with tongues. Let all things be done decently and in order.
Thank you. So this is kind of also, especially this being our MMVS Bible study, this is one thing that's very kind of hard to kind of make sure to explain or to be able to see what is the true sense of what St. Paul is trying to say, because it says outright in verse 34, let your women keep silent in the church. So what does that mean? What does St. Paul mean by this? He infers women can pray and prophesy with their heads covered, as we saw earlier in chapter 11, verse 5. He says that as long as their heads are covered, they can prophesy. He's mentioned that previously. And we know when we look at the Old Testament, there are women prophetesses, Miriam, Moses' sister, and Deborah, who's one of the judges. And even when we look in the New Testament, the prophecy on the day of Pentecost speaks of sons and daughters will prophecy. And that's found in Acts 2. And even as we look in later in Acts and in the tradition, it says that St. Philip, one of the evangelists or the apostles, had 4 daughters who prophesied. It's mentioned in the scripture, right? So we can infer, if you're looking at specifically, St. Paul is not meaning that women have to be totally silent in the church, right? Though it says, when you look at it, it says, let your women be silent, right? And we know even in our Malayali churches, that's why for a long time we had women not voting and not to be able to speak, and and all these kind of things. They might point to this verse from 1 Corinthians. when we look at it as a totality of the scriptures, he's probably not meaning that total silence. If you look in the context of this chapter, it infers that the speaking is specifically in regards to discerning and correcting the prophets during the worship. Okay. And so if one speaks in the tongue without interpreting, is to be silent. And a prophet whose prophetic message has been disallowed by discerning judgment is to be silent. So it is in this context, St. Paul is stating, women do not have the authority to give judgment on the prophecy. This is left to the elders, leaders, presbyters, right? So then that's what we say in some transitions, the leaders of the worship are presbyters, that's the Greek word for priests. And so we know, even to this day in our Orthodox Church and even Catholic churches, we only have men who are chosen from amongst the community to be chosen for the specific priest ordained ministry of priesthood. Whereas, St. Peter talks about all are part of the royal priesthood, but the specific liturgical and this leadership role in the community, it's only amongst the men. So when St. Paul says the women to be silent, when we look in the context, particularly in this chapter, in the verses just previous to this, we can infer, and as interpreted by the church, that is meaning more specifically that the judgment of the prophecy is given to the leader. And from the early church and even to this day, the leadership of the community are chosen amongst the men. So the men are the ones who have been chosen amongst the community to be as the elders, leaders, and presbyters. They're the ones who are given the right to speak on those things, right? And so when we look at the earliest indication from the scriptures, women do not have this leadership role in the church, but submit themselves to the presbyters' leadership. And so that's where in the context when it talks about the women to be silent, like I said, in other churches and even in our church and in the churches in India, because of how the roles of men and women are seen in ancient times as women are so submissive in so many ways. And so when it comes to the church, it's interesting because it's still amongst the community in the context of the cultures that in which the church is being preached. At the same time, there's a change too, right? St. Paul says there's no, male or female, Greek or Jew, all are worshiping. So when we look at in the totality of orderliness and how things are worshipped, but how the community is transformed, we have to understand where all these things coming from. So and when you look back even at the early church and even in the early ancient times, when it came for worship, when we look at the historical records, even during those times, women did not have a right even to come into the church at all. Even when you look at the Jewish temple, there was a section for the women which was behind, and there's a section for the men that was closer to where the worship was being offered, or the sacrifices were being offered. Whereas the men were in the front and the women are in the back. And then outside of the Gentiles, or the non-believers, right? So we see that, men forward, women back. At the same time, even in the synagogues, the different times that we see that Jesus did healings, we know that he did heal women, but we look at in the older ways, the scripture, the archaeological finds, even there was a separation between the men and the women, where the men were always closer to where the speakers were and to lead and where the Torah was being kept, and the women were kind of off to the side or into the back. What we see in the Christian worship, that's changed to where, just like in our churches, men and women are side by side, both are equally close to the altar, but there's still a sense of where the leadership is and where the roles of men and women are for the functioning of the church. And part of the context of the culture, particularly we know, as St. Paul is saying, the women are to not have that leadership role. And we still have that to this day, though we still allow certain leadership and abilities for the women to have and to roles within the liturgy, but specifically to the priesthood, we still keep that tradition that's been handed down through the church and through the scriptures, as we see here in St. Paul's epistle to the Corinthians. This specific teaching role, when it comes to interpreting and defining the faith, has been given only to the presbyters. It's not even all the men, it's to these presbyters, right, which are chosen only amongst the men. So that shows that St. Paul is remaining in line with what has been handed down, right? And so, but he says further, but if women want to discuss, they discuss with their husbands at home, which is, that's just to remind us that the women don't have no role in that and learning, like it's not to be so silent that they can't talk about it at all. They talk with the husbands, and then same time when the husbands are coming to the community where they're allowed to speak to the leadership because of how the customs are at the time, those can be brought up there, right? But everything is done to make sure that there's an orderliness in the worship of the church, right? And so, like I said, but even in the context, even now modern times, it's not so separate. Even in terms of speaking, we allow women to give messages and to give sermons, and that especially be it on a Sunday service or more particular, more during these our MMVS conferences and meetings, even our family conference here in the southern region. One of our main speakers is one of our Kwachamas, Merlin Kwachama, who's a well-known speaker. So things do adapt and change to the times, but we still hold fast to these the faith and tradition that's been given to us by Christ and the apostles and the church, and that has been handed down in the scriptures, right? And so all these things are all these teachings are part of the universal norms and practices of the church. The prophets are spirituals. Prophets or spirituals accept and really know the apostles' decisions. So they accept sorry, I miswrote that. They accept the teaching of the apostles, then their decisions, right? And so church members standing in the church is dependent on their adherence to the teachings and the spirituality of the church and the accepting of the apostolic traditions, right? So the key thing about this is when we look at this ending of chapter 14, when we talk about in the church, particularly Orthodox Church, that we're holding fast to what has been handed down to us. This is one of the chapters that we see that St. Paul is laying down that there's an orderliness and there's a need to adhere to what the teachings of the apostle are, because which I did mention earlier, we know that when it talks about that the elders or the presbyters, they're being the ones being who are ordained by the who are by the bishops who are in line, who have been selected from as you go back down in the line of succession is coming from the apostles who get their teachings from Christ himself, right? So that the apostolic succession, which is so important within the traditional churches in that have bishops, the key thing about that is to remind is that the all that has been handed down in faith to the church through the faithful is being entrusted to the bishop, right? That's why it's so important that we have bishops. That's when we look in the early church, many church fathers, right? That if there's where the bishop is, there's a church, meaning that he is responsible to make sure to pass down those practices and teachings and the faith that Christ has given, and to make sure that we don't deviate from that, right? And so the visible sign of holding fast to those practices is found in the bishop. At the same time, it is followed by the people. And even if the people see a bishop is not following in line with the faith that we know that's been handed down, that's when we start having councils and meetings to say, hey, what this priest or this bishop is teaching, it seems to be not in line with what we remember that's been handed down from generations. And then all the other bishops will come together to discern and discuss, and they say, yeah, this is right or this is wrong, right? And so all that means is, even in the church, the little church, meaning like the local church, the parish church, that's already also being found. The people accept that what the presbyter is admonishing and teaching and saying yes or no, or right or wrong. He's upholding what's been handed down faithfully to him by the church, right? And so, but if there's any deviation from that, be it from particularly from people who are speaking tongues or prophesying or whatever it might be, or even if a priest is starting to preach something that's unknown, is now coming to the ears of the community that's might be not properly understood or seen as not in line with what's given, then we have to check those things, right? So even there's a checks and balances, even to the presbyters. They're referred to the bishops, and the bishops are referred to the it gets so far, it gets to the ecumenical councils where they're deciding on theological discussions of what is true and what is not, right? And so this chapter 14, though it's very specific to the church in Corinth, it's interesting that it's still applicable to how we understand, how we uphold the faith and teachings of the church, right? So like, when you look at the Qurbana, before, we read even from the epistle for Saint Paul, right? You know, we sing the Paulo Sleha song, and if you just read it in English, you know, and just as a like if it's just a prayer, it says, "I have heard Paul, the blessed apostle, say, if any man or angel teaches a gospel to you other than what we had preached, let him be cut off from the church. Behold, how perverse doctrines are springing forth from all sides. Blessed is he who begins and ends in the Lord's teaching." You know, so we sing that every Sunday, right? And this is taken from different parts of St. Paul's epistle. This particular passage for the song, Paulo Sleha's song, is taken from Galatians, but it reminds us that time and time again in St. Paul's epistles, he's reminding that we are called to uphold the Lord's teaching, right? And the only way that we can be assured that we're in line with the Lord's teaching is making sure that the people who have been set apart by Christ's disciples, his apostles, and how they continue to pass that down, the faith that has been handed down to them. That is where we find where the line is, right, for what is true and not, right? And so the people have to be very mindful of that and critical of that, right, too. And so the priests are responsible for that. But at the same time, it's always interesting, you know, when we do electing vertidominies or of our bishops, you know, or choosing of our bishops, there's always an election. So to make sure that the people can see that this is a qualified person who can stand and make those decisions, right? And so that's how the people as a whole have a participation in that. And then even though, like I said earlier, there wasn't so much participation by the women before, particularly in our church, now that it's changed, now that we have the women now voting and part of the committees of local parish churches and send the representatives for the electing of the bishops of the church, right? And so, and that's all in line with what we find in the scriptures, right? And that's, sorry, I know it was a short, just finishing off this chapter 14, but because I wanted to give time for discussions, because I know there's a lot to unpack there. Are there any questions or comments or clarifications on this last section of chapter 14, or we can even go back to the previous time, if anything from the previous section or what we've talked about? I wanted to give time for that today. You know, I know we're a little small in number today, but any questions on that?
Actually, it's Sabina. I just was happy that you clarified that whole reading about women being silent, because I never understood that. Like, so I appreciate it.
Okay. Even for me, when I started, because it's always a difficult passage to understand.